On today's episode of Fall Forward, we're speaking to Martin Gutmann, author of The Unseen Leader and professor at HSLU. Thank you for joining us today on Fall Forward. It's so lovely to have you here. We always start these with a bit of an introduction, Martin. For those of our listeners and members who perhaps haven't met you or aren't aware of you yet, would love to learn about you and your background, what brought you to where you are, and then we'll get stuck into some of the really exciting areas of conversation for today.
That sounds great. Let's do it. And first of all, thanks so much for having me on the show. It's just looking in the background, embrace failure, discover growth. I love that. And we can dig into that a bit as we get going here in our conversation. But first of all, who am I? What brought me here? I was always interested in and fascinated by stories. You know, the stories that people told about their lives, the stories I read about in adventure books and books about kings and queens and peasants who lived a long time ago. So as a kid, I just really loved stories, especially nonfiction. And then as I went through school and university and graduate school, I just gravitated towards history because, you know, is kind of the study of the human story. And I suppose one little transition or development was that as I, developed academically, I became more and more interested in the larger stories society tells, like the myths, that the narratives that we use to prop up certain political or economic systems, et cetera, and kind of playing around with trying to understand where those came from and perhaps gently pushing back on some of them, et cetera. So long story short, out of this kind of love and fascination for stories, I got a bunch of degrees in history and political science, including a PhD in history, and now teach at a business school in Switzerland. And that's also an interesting place for a historian to be. I really enjoy it, but it's not the typical faculty that a historian would find a home in. But I'm happy that I did.
Yeah, how do you, as a historian, end up in a business school? Because you're absolutely right. It's not a traditional place for a historian to be. How does that happen?
Well, to be fair, it's more unusual in Europe than it is in the US. So a lot of the bigger American business schools have historians on faculty because I guess there's, in general, in the university system, a bit more of this liberal arts emphasis, this emphasis that no matter what your specialization is, you need to have some of these broader human competencies, the ability to critically examine where we came from and based on that to understand the decisions you make today and where we're going. So if you look at, let's say, Harvard or Northwestern or a lot of these famous business schools in the US, they have lots of historians. In Europe, it's a bit different. I feel like the business schools here are a bit narrower in their emphasis. Also, subjects like, let's say, ethics and international relations that are all very relevant for managers are present, but not to the same extent that they might be in the US. But how did I specifically end up at a business school? It's just one of these quirks in my life that we all have. I never imagined that that's where I would end up, but I got my first full-time job in a management faculty and then just really liked it and then moved on to a second position at a different business school. And I guess, it's what I enjoy is that I realize like a lot of the topics, a lot of the big questions that people ask in a business school are actually quite similar to the ones historians ask. We just come at them with entirely different assumptions and kind of a different toolkit as well. So that's it's a fun place to be for that reason.
That's a really interesting point about, the similarity of reviewing and considering the past in order to obviously, hopefully, do a better job in the future. Of course, the theme of the podcast is falling forward and this idea of hopefully viewing our past failures as an opportunity to learn and celebrating that as leaders, which often we don't, because the culture or the environment perhaps doesn't allow us to do so. So that's partly what we're really excited to talk to you about. Martin, I saw you recently. You were doing a TED talk about why are we celebrating the wrong leaders, and I think perhaps I'd love to perhaps start there, or maybe start just one step actually before that, which is perhaps the story of the book over your shoulder, The Unseen Leader, and understanding what we can learn, or what leaders can learn from history. This idea of hopefully falling forward as leaders and learning from some of those historical leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. So the book, The Unseen Leader, came out about a year ago. Grew out of this idea, or this insight, or you can even call it like an itch that I had from day one that I started teaching in a business school. And I was finally able to kind of collect my thoughts, and I'd had enough chances to refine my ideas through discussions with colleagues and trusted friends. And so I'm happy that I finally, it feels good when you manage to actually put something concrete down on paper. I have lots of other thoughts where I've not gotten that far yet. And the idea was this: when I started working in this business school environment, I noticed immediately that one of the hot topics, of course, is leadership, right? Not just as a field of study, but also something in all of the MBA students that I met. Like, we all want to be good leaders. It's something we aspire to. I think less so than other things. If you're in accounting, you probably want to do a good job. You take it seriously. But I don't know many accountants who kind of imagine, on their tombstone, it's going to say like the best accountant ever. That's not something we aspire to, but we all aspire to kind of living up to these heroic standards of leadership, and being perceived and appreciated as a leader is something I think many of us aspire to. And what I noticed was that in this business school environment, in a lot of this leadership literature, looking back on past leaders was actually a relatively popular way of exploring leadership, either through case studies on Winston Churchill or Ernest Shackleton or Napoleon, or simply in how people talked about leadership. Very often people grasp for these historical anecdotes. And what I noticed was that how these past leaders are sometimes talked about in, let's say, the management leadership environment doesn't necessarily correspond with how professional historians interpret these persons and interpret the influence that they had or didn't have on events. So there was a bit of a dissonance there. And in particular, I identified something that I came to call the action fallacy, which is this idea that when we look to the past, we have a tendency to single out the loudest, the most heroic, those leading from the front, the ones who suffered the most dramatic circumstances. We tend to pick those out as the leaders to celebrate. When in fact, I would say that many, of course not all, but many really successful leaders of the past, those who really had a vision and were able to put that into practice, circumvented dramatic circumstances, right? Because their leadership and their ability to control events and people was successful enough that they did not suffer any near death or dramatic circumstances. So they kind of remain unseen because they're less exciting than some of their colleagues. So in the TED Talk, I think I summarized this with the phrase that we confuse a good story for good leadership. That's really the point, that there are some historical figures who make for amazing stories. Ernest Shackleton, the Anglo-Irish explorer, is a case in point. Really thrilling reading. Wow. If you read about his expeditions, they're page turners. I heard rumors that Disney's making a series now about him. It's fantastic. I love it. But he's not the guy I would want to learn, or look to for leadership lessons, because every one of his expeditions ended in, near disaster or disaster.
It's that human requirement to hear and understand through story, isn't it, Martin? That I think that sits behind a lot of what you're talking about there. Why is it for leaders that we, or I suppose, or as people in business that we celebrate those stories? What is it in terms of the qualities that leaders, I suppose, that you've seen are really important? What qualities really shine through? But also, why is it that those louder leaders that you talk about, why is it that those stories are the ones that we stick to as opposed to the ones that are quietly successful? What's the big difference that you're seeing there, or the big things that stand out?
I mean, I think we have an admiration for people who overcome hardship. And I think we should. There's something inspiring in people who are dealt, a bad hand and find a way to extricate themselves and be successful nonetheless. When it comes to picking leadership role models, though, I think we have to be a bit more critical. And what I mean by that is specifically, if somebody's always finding themselves in a crisis or really challenging circumstances, is that because they're just unlucky? Or is it because they're not doing something they could be doing to avoid these circumstances in the first place, or respond to them as they start to, rear their ugly head, so to speak? And you very quickly find, if you look, let's stick with the example of polar exploration, that you have some who always found themselves in these near crisis or crisis circumstances, lots of drama, lots of near death and some death. And you have others who don't. And if we want to draw leadership lessons, I think we should look for those who manage to mitigate and circumvent drama where others failed to do exactly that. They're less exciting, they're a bit more boring, but if it's leadership lessons we're going for, those are the ones we should be looking at.
Why is it you think that generally, as humans, we're less interested in those successful stories, the ones that just go off without a hitch because someone's done a really good job of it, versus the ones that have that drama, that excitement, that failure? What is it in us that you think that causes that to resonate so strongly?
Well, I think there's two things. On the one hand, when we look at these, so I call them unseen leaders in my book, if we just take a quick glance at them, it's kind of challenging to pick out or discern what it is they actually do. So on first look, it just looks like they got lucky, and then it's easy to be a bit more dismissive of what they did. Whereas we have these other leaders who, had to work really hard to extricate themselves from, in Shackleton's case, this pack ice, or other cases, some encirclement by an enemy army. And that's what we gravitate towards. And what's been interesting for me is that this book was very much a conversation starter. So after I published it, I lean a little bit in the book on, let's say, more recent insights from organizational psychology. But what I didn't realize is that there's so much contemporary work that essentially establishes exactly the same thing that I arrived at through this historical analysis. That, in a workplace environment, we tend to see leadership potential today in people who speak more, regardless of what they say. We tend to see leadership potential in people who appear busy, regardless of what they're actually doing. And people who display confidence, regardless of their competence, tend to be perceived as leaders. So we have this collection of biases, not just in our, looking back for historical role models, but in our offices today. Where do those come from? That's a great question, and one that I don't exactly feel qualified to answer at this point.
Perhaps a good area for the next book, Martin, is because I think we'll solve lots of conundrums for us as people if we can answer that question.
Absolutely, and maybe I should dedicate some time to that. And so the other interesting thing is, like I said, the book's been a conversation starter. I've had so many great discussions with people. I also recall there was a baseball scout who reached out to me. And he said he's noticed this phenomenon in baseball that even among professional scouts whose job it is to pick out the best players and figure out how much you should pay them and how you should train them, have this bias for the players who make the most spectacular catches, who have to run and dive to catch the ball. But what he said is there are other players who never have to run and dive to catch the ball because they're always standing in the right spot.
Really interesting.
But, I get it. If I'm watching a game on TV, I'd much rather see people diving left and right to make catches. Those are the players I would say, wow, that's the guy. He really won the match for the team this time.
Yeah, you've reminded me of that movie, the Moneyball movie, where of course
Yeah.
they create the unsexiest baseball team, but on paper, with the money that they had, a high performing team, and I think that's as leaders, I think you're absolutely right. I think we often put ourselves in this category of seeing people's loud, notable successes and actually missing their quiet, consistent delivery, and perhaps overweighing one than the other. Um, how as leaders then can we combat that, Martin? What should we be thinking about? If I think about all of our members and people listening to this this podcast, what is it that we should be mindful of when we're leading ourselves and building teams and leading organizations so that we reprioritize that focus?
I think it depends a bit on where you are in an organization. So I think ideally we would develop different cultures within our organizations that also privilege and celebrate those who are responsible for organizational successes, but might not be so loud, so vivid, so noticeable on first glance. Most of us, of course, are not at the very top of organizations. We, are leading somewhere in the middle. Then I think you face a bit of a dilemma if you are one of these unseen leaders who does have a good sense for, what needs to happen. You're able to motivate and engage people to work with you towards a goal, but how you do it is not as visible as some of your, say, loud and, constantly crisis-prone colleagues. The question then is, should you start to kind of display some of that loud behavior as well, simply so that you get noticed? I think that's a pretty personal decision. Or should you try to find a different organization that maybe embraces a more holistic view of leadership? That's not something I can't tell people what to do there. I think it depends on where you find yourself.
Yeah, I think it raises quite an interesting point. I know there's a couple of members that I've spoken to in the last few months who've almost echoed this idea before I knew it as the unseen leader. This idea of quiet, successful delivery, and that perhaps they've been overlooked in areas because of that consistency, because of the almost delivery without drama that they've achieved. And the question posed by them was, well, look, do I need to be louder? Do I need to push myself more in that regard? And I think it's a challenge for leaders to think about that, because I'm sure, in any sense, pushing yourself into an area where you're uncomfortable as a leader is a challenge. But there's also this slight moral piece around whether it's the right thing to do as well, which is interesting. I don't know if you've seen that in your experience in the business school in terms of coaching and leading leaders. How people are grappling with that balance of doing the right thing.
Yeah, it really is a dilemma, right? Because do you want to engage in what's essentially a piece of theater for the sake of getting noticed, right? And maybe you have to get ahead. But I would also feel uncomfortable with that, I think. And I think things are changing, though. I mean, there is a trend to also seeing the great potential that, let's say, more introverted leaders and team members have. Obviously, the idea that only white men can lead is something where some people still cling to, but is proving to be very wrong in many high functioning organizations that do embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion. So things are changing, but I think we have a long way to go still. And what you individually can do, I think there's that challenge in many areas of life that at the end of the day, we live and work in these large groups that have large group norms, and we can do a very small part to change them. But the temptation is there just to learn to live with the norms, but then those norms persist.
Yeah, I think changing large norms is a challenge. I think because it's pace, isn't it? It's the pace of that change that can be glacial, and you referenced
Yeah.
this heretical problem of course, leaders of large enterprises typically being white middle class men. It's had to change, and it's changing, but it's still changing slower than perhaps it should. We still see women underrepresented as they should be on boards, and all I suppose all backgrounds being underrepresented. It's an area that's important to us as an organization because we're celebrating this idea of cognitive diversity, which provides a slightly different lens, Martin, which is this idea about how you think. And I think one of the things that was interesting for me when we looked at your book is that actually your leadership style is a representation of your experiences and how you think. And also can be contributed to in terms of where you come from. I wonder if there's any particular patterns that you've seen in the leaders and historical figures, perhaps also that you've looked at, that show you to be one way or the other, if you like, to be the seen or the unseen leader. And then I'm just thinking in terms of ways in which our members can more readily identify themselves and then coach themselves perhaps to embrace other areas of leadership.
Yeah. I mean, my intention was not to uncover, let's say, some leadership secrets or a kind of leadership recipe formula that you can apply. It was simply to say, hey, look, there's this whole cohort of unseen, that is leaders we've kind of forgotten, overlooked, who had a tremendous impact, often a much bigger impact than the guys, and usually it's guys we tend to celebrate in hindsight. But that's not to say that good leaders should always remain unseen, or if you're visible or leading from the front, that's a bad thing. I think the thing that history really shows in terms of leadership is that it's very situational, right? And what works and what's required in one scenario might be the opposite in a different one. So I think from that, I think one statement that is true of all the great leaders that I've looked at in detail is that they had, say, excellent situational awareness. Both situational in terms of the social environment, this emotional intelligence, but also, let's say, the bigger forces, the bigger context within which they found themselves, and were able to adjust their behavior and, let's say, their leadership style depending on those circumstances. I think that really is a universal quality. And then the question is, how do you acquire that? I think the easy answer would be to say, or the kind of superficial answer is to say, well, you need a lot of experience in different types of scenarios. You need a lot of practice. But I think experience alone is not enough. You need to, with your experience, make a habit of self-reflecting, of kind of learning about, what did I do that contributed to a successful outcome, and what did I do that maybe got in the way this time or was not as ideal. So that's perhaps another universal quality or near universal quality, is that the great leaders I've looked at and work with today and have looked at in the past are very self-reflective. They're able to look in the mirror and draw the appropriate conclusions about their roles in the events that unfolded, whether the conclusions are, put them in a positive light, or maybe that time a more negative light.
Yeah, I think it's a really hard thing, isn't it, for leaders to do that, to truly look at themselves in the mirror and say, oh, crap, actually, I'm not very good at that. And to give themselves the space and time to reflect and to honestly coach themselves and improve themselves in that space. I think a big part of the reason that we wanted to create this podcast was to normalize this idea of failure in senior leadership, because most leaders are very good at creating an environment for their teams to fail and learn. But actually, as a boardroom, as a leadership group, we still expect ourselves to be infallible and to portray to shareholders and to wider industry this almost perfect leadership, which of course is not real. And yeah.
No, you're right, and I'm thinking back now to our discussion about stories. I think a tell of what kind of leader a person is the story they tell around their own failures, right? So if if your failures, if you always interpret or talk about them as if they were due to external circumstances, to decisions of others, but not any decisions or actions that I took, but always talk about our successes as stemming from decisions we took, etc. I think that's a telltale sign that somebody is not self-reflective enough, that somebody is unwilling to be critical with themselves. Because I think failure, you can always find some things you could have done differently, and you can always find some things in the external circumstances that contributed to the failure. But I think you have to be open and honest about that fact.
How's that going to be changing moving forward, Martin? So arguably we're entering a period where the pace of change is like never before. As leaders, what do we need to be thinking about as we head into this modern world? What is it that you sort of foresee as those key things that you could take perhaps from history and project forward that would be useful for us as leaders moving forward?
There's been a lot of, I'd say, really good research on what it takes to be a successful leader. In some ways, I think there's no secret there. The secret is, or the challenge is, in the application of it. So I think, to be a successful leader today, you have to balance a few things. You have to find a balance, and the balance where exactly you should fall depends on the circumstances. But if we look at highly successful teams, whether it's in sports or organizations, etc., the leaders will typically have very high standards, right? They're driving performance. There's a bit of these higher expectations, but that is balanced with an absolute emphasis on the relationships, on empathy, on making sure that people feel supported and appreciated and cared for. And the same, I think, if we're looking inwardly on leaders, what the research also tells us that there needs to be this balance between confidence and humility. Right? You need to believe in yourself. You can't second guess every decision you take. But overconfidence is a real danger. Right? You also need to be aware that you might not be the person with the right answer all the time. You might not be best placed to solve every problem. Right? You need that humility and that willingness to ask for help to integrate the work of others. So again, I think being a good leader requires balancing a lot of these extremes that we find in unsuccessful leaders. And moving forward, are you referring specifically to AI here, or just in general?
Yeah, let's cover that, because I think it's definitely on the lips of everybody at the moment in terms of what am I doing with it? What does it mean to my business? What does it mean to us as humanity, let alone in the working sphere? So I'd love perhaps to get your views on what that could mean to us moving forward.
Definitely. And, with all these questions, I always start with the historical perspective. So I ask myself, what have other technologies that promise to be time-saving meant for work in the past? We can look in all kinds of spheres. I mean, one is, for example, the vacuum cleaner. We could think of more recently, email, etc. They both came with the promise of really saving time and thereby making life and work easier, because it would free up more time for leisure activities or more time to concentrate on other activities. So let's take the vacuum cleaner, which was introduced at the turn of the last century. It was really promised as a miracle tool for housewives who, had to do all the cleaning back then, already then working both outside of the home and in the home. And it could radically reduce the time, or it promised to radically reduce the time that housewives would have to dedicate to keeping the house clean. What happens once we have the vacuum cleaner? Well, the expectations of cleanliness just went up. Instead of having to sweep the house or the apartment once a week, you now have to vacuum every day. So it is a time-saving device, but only if the expectations remain static, which they don't. Same with email. It should shorten our communications channels, speed things up, save resources. What happens? We have an absolute explosion in, let's say, the expectations around how much we should and do communicate. And I think we're fooling ourselves if we don't expect a similar thing out of the advent of AI, that it will make certain tasks we do now faster, it's easier, but our expectations will adjust accordingly. The volume of our output, whether it's social media posts or internal communications or reports or whatever the case might be, those will inevitably adjust to the potential that AI has.
I think that's a viewpoint that I hadn't come across, Martin, actually, this idea, particularly, around our expectations. I almost feel like, is there an opportunity right now to try and refrain some of those expectations? Because you're absolutely right. If we just embrace the tool, if we just embrace the technology without perhaps being cognizant of that conversation, we can miss the opportunity to really make change or create change in the way that perhaps we hope it to happen, as opposed to it just happens to us. So I think that's a really interesting point. I hadn't thought about the vacuum cleaner, but yeah, it definitely resonates with me. I think, with I think the pace of change being one thing that leaders are talking to us about at the moment. They can't keep up with the ideas and knowledge and all the things that they need to know just in their own domain, let alone within the breadth of leadership responsibilities that they will increasingly hold. How should, what have you seen perhaps when you were looking at those historical leaders, looking forward? What should we be thinking about in order to embrace that? Because we can't know it all. So what are the skills or traits perhaps that you think would be resonant to leaders today to be mindful of?
Well, I think one thing that has, let's say, remained static or remained the same is the fact that part of what makes leadership challenging, or what makes it challenging to be in a leadership role, is that you have to make decisions within a context of some kind of deficit, right? So you're lacking some critical information or some critical resources or time, right? If this were not true, then it would actually be quite easy often to figure out what the right decision to make is, because you can just gather all the information and analyze it in peace and quiet. And I think that's often the challenge, right? That we've been missing something or multiple things required to know which direction to go in or what to do. That was true in the past. In some ways, it's less true today because we have all these tools at our disposal that can not only collect data, but also aggregate it and analyze it for us. However, what we have now is that we're simply overwhelmed by the amount. Yeah, and I think so the challenge still persists, that there's a cognitive limit to how much we can take in and process and make decisions around. So that's the one thing. And you asked what can leaders from the past teach us about this. I think maybe just recognizing that that's inherent in leadership, that there is a degree of uncertainty, and you have to find strategies to cope with that, both for you personally, emotionally, but also within your teams and organizations. I do worry a bit about the pace of change, right? There seem to be more areas of uncertainty today than there have been in previous periods, and the pace of change, how quickly things can change in the realm of politics or technology or climate, is disconcerting. And I think we see that in the numbers too. There is anxiety is on the rise in many countries. A feeling of disengagement from work is at an all-time high, at least looking back the last few decades. So yeah, I think there are some things we should be concerned about. Let's put it that way.
I'm trying to think of the study name, Martin, off the top of my head, but it talks about that, the resonance of work to workers and the importance of work in their lives. And you're absolutely right, it's definitely declining, and almost at a point at which in history we've not seen before, where work is becoming less important to people than it's perhaps been in the past. If you were a coal miner. You were a coal miner. That was you for your life. And now we talk about having 5 or 6 or 7 careers, or 9 careers, even if it's my daughter's generation. Um, how how can we grapple with that?
Well, I would say that one response to that would be to say that today we have the luxury to have interests other than work, which of course was true for the aristocracy in the past, but for, let's say coal miner, there wasn't a lot of time left for too many other passions in life, right? To put it a bit facetiously, right? For many people, work was what you did. There were some festivals, some other distractions. People went to church, but you spent most of your time. Certainly, since the start of the Industrial Revolution, the working class has had, say, some severe challenges. So that's in some ways a good thing. That certainly not across the globe, and certainly not across all industries and sectors. Even in the West, I think there's a big class of people who are engaged in very precarious work, long hours, poor pay, etc. But at the same time, I think there's a bigger group of people who have the luxury of thinking about other aspects of life. But I think just compared to pre-pandemic levels, among that group of, let's say, knowledge workers, this level of disengagement has grown as well. And why is that? I think the pandemic played a role. I think also, something in how businesses are led is not really capturing people the way perhaps it should, capturing their attention and their passions. And I wonder if it has to do with how people are integrated into their organizations and teams. I think this idea of an organization having a brilliant mission statement and values about their workers is nice, but it has to be lived and it has to be felt by the people working there. Otherwise, it's just words.
Yeah, in fact, this idea of purpose that is so often banded around by leaders. Our team's alignment to purpose, our team's alignment to our mission as an organization. It's the sexy thing to have. Everyone has to have it, but I think if you look back through history, I'm not sure all organizations had that, and yet we all aspire to have it now. I think I'd be really interested to get your thoughts on, perhaps in some of those historical examples, the role that perhaps purpose played. If you think about Shackleton and the like, people are risking their lives here. This is not, I went to work for 9 to 5. That alignment to purpose is critical in those scenarios. So I suppose what could you take from those examples that would perhaps be helpful for leaders to get that alignment, to get that excitement back to really want to deliver?
Yeah. I think, to be honest, if I can push back a bit, I think it's a bit of a false, or let's say a fraught parallel, because if so, in Shackleton's case, he and his men find themselves stuck without their ship. The ship was crushed by the ice, and they're long ways away from South Georgia, the nearest kind of hope of rescue that they have. And in some ways, the purpose is kind of given by the circumstances there. And Shackleton does do a very admirable job in terms of keeping his men focused on and believing in their survival. So hats off to him there. Once disaster strikes, which he could have done a lot to avoid, at that point, he really leads his men successfully to safety. But I think the challenge is, right, that in a lot of organizations, we're not on polar expeditions. We're not in a war zone where this urge to survival, this inner purpose is so self-evident and front and center. And I think some companies in some ways draw the wrong lessons from a Shackleton episode of these, because they try to have purpose statements that evoke the same boldness and the same, let's say, desire to change the world. When in fact, if you're working lower level in a big multinational, I think that kind of statement, like we are changing the world, I don't know if that inspires me. What matters more to me is how I am treated on a day-to-day basis and the interactions I have with people within the organization and with my clients. And if I feel like in my little microcosm, I'm being appreciated and I can make a difference, that matters more than these, let's say, very abstract, very bold uh, purpose statements.
I think it's a really good thing to call out. I think what you're saying is that it's about making whatever your mission, your statement, your purpose real for individuals in your organization at every level, and that's the only way that you'll really make it come to life. I've got to ask you, Martin, who is in all of the historical research, who's your favorite leader that you've researched, and why?
I have a lot. So we've talked a lot about Shackleton, and as I mentioned, he's a very very exciting expeditions because of these near disasters and disasters always. Um, the the um, the person I really look up to in the polar environment is the Norwegian Roald Amundsen, who had very boring expeditions but was always successful. So he's a person there. And then, it depends on if we're looking at business or politics, etc. A leader I've looked into a lot lately because I kind of rediscovered him as I was thinking back to my early childhood is Bill Cartwright, who was the co-captain of the Chicago Bulls with Michael Jordan during the Chicago Bulls' absolutely, I think, unique dominance of the National Basketball Association in the 1990s. And why I admire Bill Cartwright so much is because he wasn't a particularly good basketball player. He had been earlier, but he was past his prime. He was quite old by the time we get to the 90s. But he is really able to relate to all of the players. He's this kind of mentor figure who's just, without scoring points, without blocking shots, without doing any of these visible things on the basketball court, is just able to change the feel in the team, how people play when he's around. And in that sense, he's the perfect, we talked about leaders needing to balance things. He's the perfect parallel to Michael Jordan, who's of course the ultra performer and kind of pushes and drives the team to always keep the bar high. And Bill Cartwright is the nice balance to that, who prioritizes the human side. So, and in some ways, then I guess the other great leader in the scenario is the coach Phil Jackson, who had the good sense of appointing Bill Cartwright to be co-captain with Michael Jordan.
I love that example. I wasn't perhaps so aware of that example. We've literally just launched in Chicago, and of course, Jordan still has such a huge. Yeah. You can feel his presence in the city when you're there still, all these years later. And but as an organization, obviously, we're so focused on celebrating this idea of cognitive diversity and this idea that, as a leader, when you look across your team, you can't have a team of Michael Jordans because your team won't be successful. You need the Bill Cartwright in order to make Michael Jordan as successful as he could have been.
And I would even say, even if you could have a team of Michael Jordans, which you can't, I mean, these ultra performers are so rare, I'm not sure they would work very well together.
Yeah, I agree. Well, there's an example in Europe, Real Madrid football team, they called it the Galactico period, and they signed all the best players in the world, and they were terrible together. They spent a huge amount of money, and because they didn't perhaps have the players who were doing the unnoticed, the boring things that happen to connect these wonderful performances together. I think that's a really interesting thing for us as leaders to think about, and I like that you've highlighted that because that resonates so strongly with us as an organization as well. Like not just seeing people for their loud successes, but also seeing them for their quiet successes as well, which is great. One of the things we always like to do, Martin, is ask or our members for a question to give to our upcoming podcast host. So a question we have from one of our members for you is, how can organizations or leaders avoid falling into the trap of promoting simply based on visual confidence and competence rather than the true leadership competence? What can we do as leaders?
I think this takes us back to our discussion around norms, right? I think organizations have certain norms, traditions, processes that have taken a firm hold that kind of dictate how we promote people, but also the types of people who even come into contention for being promoted. So I think it starts with challenging that, maybe with doing a critical self-assessment of, how do we even decide who to place under consideration for this role, right? For a promotion, etc. And but it's hard. I think there's no easy fix to this. Part of it is also that we're so overwhelmed. There's so many tasks bombarding us, especially as leaders. We talked about the pace of change, and to then really take the time to fundamentally think about the contributions that individuals are making within your team, how they're impacting not just the outcomes that your organization is striving for, but how individuals are impacting the team cohesion and how the team functions. This takes time. This takes a lot of, let's say, willpower and cognitive energy. So maybe carving out the time to honor that process and really invest what is necessary to do that right is also something that needs to happen. With that said, I know there's a lot of demands on people's time, so asking people to take more time to do anything is hard.
Yeah, I mean, stopping to give yourself the time to think is a hard thing, and I know that myself as leading an organization. It's a hard thing to stop and just go, actually, how can we look at that differently? Actually, is that still the way we should be doing that? Because it's very easy to hire for a role and just replace that role with what you had before, when actually perhaps stopping and looking for what do you really need and why do you need it is hard. I really like that point. Martin, we also ask our leaders when they're with us on the podcast for a recommendation, something that you as a leader through your career have found useful, or something that's really important to you in your leadership journey to share with our members, to share with our listeners. I don't know if it could be a book, it could be an experience, it could be just something that you hold dear to yourself. We always find it interesting to share that knowledge with each other.
One book that I read, this is over a year ago now, but that continues in my mind to come up no matter what I'm discussing, is the book Subtract by Leidy Klotz, who is an engineering professor in the US. And he shows through a series of very funny stories, but also experiments that he ran with some colleagues, that we have this tendency to add. Right? If we want to fix a bridge, we're going to do it by adding pieces rather than moving pieces, which might actually fix said bridge quicker at fewer costs. When writers are trying to improve their writing, they add words. They tend to not take them away, and so on and so forth across all kinds of domains of human activity. And it's just a beautiful reminder of the power of subtraction, right? If you want a healthier life, maybe the answer isn't in adding something, but in taking something away. If you want your writing to be better, maybe the answer is in cutting some things rather than always adding. So that book really changed how I look at the world, starting with my life and going all the way out to society at large.
I love that. Really lovely. You're absolutely right. It's so easy to add. It's a lot harder question to reduce. I know right at the beginning when we were creating and building Blend, one of the stories that somebody told me about a business plan was that they gave it to a near neighbor who successfully exited businesses time and time again, and it was this massive, thick business plan. And he said, "Look, I'm getting old. I can't read a business plan that's this big. Come back to me when it's smaller." And the guy went away. He rewrote it. He came back, and it was smaller. He's like, I'm in my 70s. He's like, I still can't read that. Like, just give it to me on 2 sheets. And he came back to it with 2 sheets. He said, "Do you know what? Make it just 1 sheet. Let's make it 1 sheet, and I'll spend the time to look through that." And of course, the guy was like, "For God's sake, this old guy is making me do this work." And of course, he couldn't see at the time the value of what that mentor was giving to him was that he turned his entire business model and plan into 1 sheet of paper. He'd subtracted that down to 1 sheet. And of course, he said, "This is why your business plan is now so good, because it's one
That
sheet.
is a brilliant story.
And
Yeah.
and I love that I hadn't thought of it in the idea of subtraction until you've just mentioned it. So I love connecting ideas is something that's really, really fun for us. Martin, my last question for you, just to conscious of time, is look, as somebody who is a management historian who spends his time looking at the past for lessons of the future, what excites you most about the future of leadership in our time that is now, this AI-driven and technology-driven world?
I am excited about the fact that we are starting to have great leadership role models who don't look the same, right? So if we think just to the COVID pandemic, we had Jacinda Ardern, Sanna Marin in Finland, Ardern in New Zealand, of course, Kaja Kallas in Estonia. So we're changing the norms a bit about what leadership role models look like. And I think that's true across industry as well, politics and sports. So that definitely excites me and makes me a bit more hopeful about the world in the years to come.
Yeah, and me too. I think it's a nice point to highlight, and a lovely place to perhaps end is that the leaders that got us here won't be the leaders to get us there. And I think I've really enjoyed, Martin, hearing and almost stopping with you today and taking a look backwards to think about how we reframe, we subtract, we listen to the leaders who perhaps aren't as loud. And thank you so much for sharing with us all your insights today. And we look forward to continuing the conversation with you here in Blend another day.
It was a pleasure. Thanks so much, Steve.
Thanks, Martin. Make sure you subscribe to the 4 Forward channel so you don't miss any new episodes. I'll see you soon.